Hello and good evening, or whatever time it is when you're watching this. This is episode number 22 of the Luminosity of Free Software. We have a bunch of people in the IRC channel, which I'm just saying hi to now. It's the #Luminosity on irc.freenode.net, in case you're wondering where that is. If you join us for the live part of the show and not catching it later, obviously, you can find all of us there discussing and chatting and asking questions that I hopefully will be able to answer at the end of the show. So this week's episode, I think, has got some really good topics. We're going to be looking at Git for everyone, looking at how can we introduce Git to maybe less technical people and why we'd even want to do that. And then we're going to talk about can versus should in the context of free software. Now, I had originally scheduled, due to people, the patrons on patreon.com voting for it, Linux in the enterprise. And two things happened. One, I'm still waiting for some data that I really want to include in the show. It hasn't arrived yet. So I was kind of debating, do I just do this segment without this bit of information? I was leaning towards yes. But then a couple of things happened this week that I brought up a topic in my mind that I think is very timely, important, and interesting to free software in general. And so we're going to push off the Linux in Enterprise until episode 23 in 2 weeks, and instead look at can versus should in the context of free software. And then at the end, questions that come up in the channel or that have been submitted by email and whatnot, I will cover. So let's dive right into it with Git for everyone. Before I start that, actually, I should also point out that the first couple of episodes in this series of Luminosity, starting at 20, were half an hour long. I found that just a little bit cramped. I was not really able to cover topics quite as much as I wanted. I still want to keep the show relatively short so people who are just wanting to, watch something that doesn't take, an hour of their life away can do so. So we're going to be trying for between 40 and 45 minutes this episode. And if it works out, I'm going to continue that with future episodes. It's kind of a feel my way forward. What's the sweet spot in terms of time? So Git for everyone. Revision control systems are one of the places that free software has been a leader in right from the very beginning. And this is really not surprising because the open source methodology really requires revision control systems because you have multiple people in multiple places of the world that are working on the same code base, and they need a way to share changes with each other, coordinate work, and when things go wrong, perhaps look back and find the bugs in previous revisions. In fact, in proprietary shops, I remember, especially in the 90s, it was completely normal, sadly, to see development shops in-house or companies that were actually software development companies that either had no revision control system or had what could best be described as an excuse of one. And it was completely, typical for there just to be big blobs of code sitting somewhere that people worked on together, kind of. So free software really, led the way here, starting from CVS. For those of you who remember that venerable tool, actually it started in 1986, and it was built on a bunch of scripts around patch and diff and RCS. So it all started way back then, and it's progressed quite a ways since then. We now typically use Git in the free software world to track changes in a set of files. So the biggest changes that Git brought were to the masses anyways. It wasn't the first tool that did this by any means. There were several before it, but it brought decentralized revision control. And what that means is that you don't have to have a server. You can have a server. You can have multiple servers. Within Git, there's no definition of what is the canonical upstream, the repository, which is kind of neat. It also means you can work offline. So when I'm in an airplane or a tram, or I just, for whatever reason, I'm not on the net, I can still work and be committing changes in Git. And then when I get back to network, I can sync up. It's really, really useful. It's very fast, which is another nice thing. But it has a reputation for being like the demon child of revision control systems when it comes to its user interface. Not easy to use, non-intuitive, etc., etc. The idea of distributed revision control and all the things you can do with it in branches and upstreams, and it's not very easy to wrap your head around, perhaps, especially at the beginning. So Git has really remained the purview of mostly software developers. Why? Because we have a great need for this kind of tool, and we don't mind this kind of complexity often. So, but I actually think that it's a tool that could be useful to and be used by a lot more people than just software developers. While we do have snapshotting file systems, it's not quite the same thing. And for an end user, that is. So if you're looking at perhaps saving changes to your configuration files in, say, home.local or home.config, you may want to revision those so you can easily, if something goes wrong, you can say, oh, let me see where that change was, or back up a week or whatnot, and easily restart. Now, yes, you can do that with a snapshotting file system, but not everyone has one. And you still, it's often easy just to end up with a snapshot of your entire file system, whereas Git makes it very easy to manage a specific set of files. So I think there's uses there. A lot of sysadmins use Git in this way. A lot of developers who maybe aren't using Git could as well, but the one target group I really have in mind, more than any others, are people that do participate in free software projects but aren't developers, aren't software programmers. So these are people that are doing translations, artwork, doing UI design, these kinds of things. And what I've found is that often these people, while they contribute to and work with a free software project, often they don't actually use the Git repositories. They often are sending files to people to commit on their behalf. And there's very little self-determination in this. And that's kind of unfortunate because Git is actually a really cool tool. But again, because it has this reputation of being like super complex and hard to use, people avoid either learning it or introducing it to people. So I thought I would kind of show how I tend to introduce Git to people that aren't as technical. So if you're really familiar with Git, this could be interesting to you to see, how can you actually get this across to people in like 5 minutes or less and actually get them going and being productive. And if you aren't familiar with Git and would like to know how to use it and like demystified a bit, maybe this is a really great 5 or 10 minute tutorial for you to get yourself up and running. Now, there are some excellent resources online. There's the Git SEM book, which has its own website. I'll put a link in the description box later on YouTube. There's a bunch of Git cheat sheets you can find online that have all the basic commands and then some not so basic commands. And of course, Git itself has online help. You just do Git help, the command name. That's great. Unfortunately, it tends to drop someone into like the deep end of the pool. I don't think it's the best place to start. So I thought we would just go straight in. I'm going to switch here to a terminal screen. 1 second, there it is, I think, hopefully. Let me just make sure it's the right one. Yeah, it is. Oops. Yes. Okay, voila. So, make sure you can see it here. I'll present to everyone. There we go. Okay, you should now be able to see my my terminal there. Great. So here I have a directory called Luminosity. It actually is where I keep a bunch of files on related to Luminosity, each episode, etc. So I don't usually start by showing people how to use Git with a server like GitHub or whatnot. Instead, I start right from the beginning. And I think this gives people a bit better idea of what's actually going on happening. They don't have this idea that there's a magic server somewhere, because in Git there isn't. And it's also nice and easy when it's all local and it doesn't feel like you're part of a big complex system, the cloud. So here it is. It's a regular repository or directory with files in it. And the first thing I show people is how to create a Git repository. So you have a directory, it may have files in it, may not, and you simply do git init. That's it, done. You now have a Git repository. And I think that really demystifies a lot of the, the difficulties with Git that people have. Again, it's this complex thing, but here you go, one command, git init, and which makes sense, initialize, and you have a Git repository. So the next thing we want to do is we want to see what files are actually in the repository. And we can ask Git at any moment for the status of things. And what it's telling us is that it has untracked files. Now, untracked files are files that simply have not yet been added to this repository. That actually tells us quite helpfully, you can git add a file to include in what will be committed. So until you add a file, it doesn't get put into the repository. So let's do that. Let's do git add. And by the way, there are UI, GUIs that you can use on top of Git. I find them not just as often even more complex and difficult than just doing it from the command line. Besides, I'm a command line jockey, so there we go. I just always use the command line as the teaching tool for Git. You can take these same concepts to the GUIs anyway, because these are the same vocabulary and verbiage. So we're going to add everything, git add star. And now if we do a git status again, boom, we see that we have a bunch of files there ready to be committed. Awesome. So I'm going to git commit, and -a means all. I can commit one file at a time by including the names, or I could do a type glob again with a star. But I'm just going to do -a, git commit all. And this is going to bring up my text editor. I use Vim here, so it could be any text editor that you like, including a GUI one. And all you do is you put in a message. So a bunch of files for Luminosity. So this becomes your title for that change. And you have to think in Git in terms of changes. So not in terms of files, but changes to files. And here we might have a slightly longer comment that allows us to explain what it is we are doing and why in a more verbose manner. And we save the file, and it tells us they've been committed. So that's pretty neat. Now, how can we see what it's actually done? Well, there's a log. And what the log is it records and will tell us every change that's been made to the files. So when we make changes to files, they're going to, well, show up in Git as a revision. So Git, whenever you have a change to a file, which we'll look at in a minute here, it's going to, and you tell it, okay, now save this change. It's going to assign it this really huge and cumbersome looking unique ID, the hash, which is completely not human friendly, but it allows it to keep every commit separate in its system. And it shows who made it, the date it was made, and then our comment. We can take that if we want. Actually, what we'll do first is we'll make a change to a file. So we'll edit episode 22. Actually, we'll episode 21 because I don't have it in here. So a small change. We made a small change to the file. And we can again do a git status. And it will tell us, oh, hey, this file has been modified. Awesome. So we know this has been changed. If we want to see what the change is, we just tell it to give us the diff, the difference. And there it is. Pluses mean it's been added. If I removed a line, it would have a minus. And that's all it is, pluses and minuses. So we added those things. If we want to commit, we do it exactly the same way we did before. And then we can do git commit -a for all. Or if I have multiple changes, I can actually do git commit, the name of the file. And again, I put in a subject, a description as well. I can just have a one-liner. Now, if I go and look at the log, it shows 2 commits. And if I want to see what changed in this commit, and it can be any commit at any time, I say git show that string. And there it is. It shows me the whole thing, including what changed, the diff. If we really want to get fancy, we can do things like git blame. And this will show us for each line what change, or in what change that that line comes from. So this is a special change, this caret C92. This is the first commit, so there is nothing before that. But we see that these two lines came from this commit, and this is just a short version of the hash. And it says, again, who did it and when. So it's a really easy way to go, oh, okay, when did that line change? And you can actually get the commit message and change for it. If we wish to, if we added a file, so let's do touch wrong file, and we'll git add wrong file, and then we'll git commit wrong file. We want this. Great, so we look at git status, everything is good, we have this wrong file, and we want to remove it at some point. So we actually can do git rm remove, and then the name of the file. And if we do git status now, it'll say this file has been deleted. And look at it, it's gone in our file system, and we then git commit. Okay. Bye-bye file. And there you go. That is Git. That's usually where I start people and kind of leave them. Right there, that is all you really need to do. Being able to see the status of things, add things, commit things, log, blame is a fancy thing almost, show a change set, remove a file. Great. You're actually moving stuff around. And that's something that almost anyone can pick up in like 5 minutes. I mean, we've done that here. And actually feel like they're not completely lost. Notice I haven't talked about branches, I haven't talked about upstreams, I haven't talked about remotes, I haven't talked about Git bisect or any of these really useful features in Git, because that just is overwhelming for most people at the very beginning. Unless they're really familiar and comfortable with revision control systems already. So the next thing I usually show people is how to actually work with repositories that are online. I also do this locally, so I create a directory like project, and I'm going to make a special kind of repository that usually is on a server. So I'm going to pretend this is actually on a server like GitHub or whatever. And I'm now going to, I want to get a copy of this. And the way we do that in Git is we do Git Clone. So we give it the address of it, which it's a local directory, so we're just going to do it locally. We're going to do Git Clone project, and we're going to call it Clone 1. We go to Clone 1, there's nothing here. And we'll make a status. Add it, git add first. This is stuff we already know. Okay, now we want to send it to the server. So we look at git log, we have changes. We want to send it from our clone, which is local here, to the original thing, which may be on our machine as it is here, but it might be on the internet somewhere. Really simple. All you do is do git push. That's it. Bing, things have pushed. Now, let's say I have a second copy of this. Make as many copies as you want, which often like blows people's minds when they see I find. And when we cloned it, we have the first file here, our content. So if I make a change to it, okay, and I'm in clone 2 here. I can ask for the diff. There's my change. So I will git commit a small change to my other clone here in this new tab. If I now do a git pull, oh, sorry, I need to git push here. There we go. Now if I do a git pull here, it'll say, oh, you're getting changes. It gives you a bunch of technical information. And now if I look at what's in that file, boom, there's the change. And that's really all there is to it. What I usually also do for people is I set up their config such that they have a auto setup rebase always for branches. So if they've made commits and there's changes on the server, when they do a git push, they'll be told, oh, you have to pull, and they'll do a git pull and do a rebase. And that's all I leave people with. I don't show them how to fix collisions. So when you have conflicts in commits, I don't show them how to do that. I don't show them how to merge. I don't show them how to branch. This is enough to get people up and going. And then they run into their first conflict. They run into, there's a branch thing. How do I use branches? And those become second and third topics. I find that's about all that people can really take in one setting. And be able to be productive. But it gives them everything they need to really start working. Changing files, removing files, adding files, pushing commits. And in 10 minutes, they're even, someone who's not a software developer tends to be good and ready to go. And at that point, they can then go explore, how do I set up a repository on GitHub? And GitHub walks them through that, for instance. And then they can go, oh, I can clone. I know how to clone. And then they do a Git clone, and then they can push and pull. This seems to work pretty well, even with young people, artists, designers. I've done it with all sorts of people. So that's how I tend to approach it. And I would love to see more people using Git, because it's an amazing tool. And of course, free software. So there we be. So we're going to shift topics now from Git to can versus should. But before we do that, I just want to give a real big thanks to all of the patrons on patreon.com. If you go to patreon.com/LOFS for Luminosity of free software, you'll find the Patreon page. And this is where people can show their support for the show by pitching in $1 or more. Some people pitch in more, obviously, per episode. And we're doing about 2 a month. And we've got a bunch of stretch goals that we're trying to work towards. The next one is providing a podcast style audio only feed with an Atom or an RSS feed with it. We're almost there, so hopefully we'll get that one soon. But these people also help pick the topics for each week and are generally just a great motivator for me as well. So thank you to all of them that have participated. And if you pitch in with or sign up with Patreon, become a patron, you can have your name there. You can get postcards from me and various other things. So moving on, can versus should. So I mentioned at the beginning there was a couple of events that happened this week in free software that brought up kind of a pet peeve of mine. And because Luminosity, we try and talk about the good things and the positive things and how we can move things forward. So I'm going to keep this really positive. At least that's the goal. And what happened was I saw that there was 2 projects within like 2 or 3 days of each other that were forked. One was Compis was forked by one downstream distribution that wanted their own window manager and were unhappy that Compis wasn't being developed much anymore. It was pretty much dead. And so took it and forked it. Instead of becoming the new upstream, they just forked it. The other one was another project that was forked, Trojita, which is a Qt-based email client with the focus on supporting, just the basic IMAP feature set, really lightweight, so to be very straightforward, etc. So there's some people that were working on a QML version of this, and the Trojita that's in git.k.org is QWidget based. It's a desktop application. So they're kind of looking at it, making it more of a mobile application, which is great and cool. But they kind of started drifting from the main project and then eventually just went, screw it, we're going to fork it. And the upstream project, Trojita, actually deleted their work from their repositories. So now there's 2 different products. And okay, so I'm not going to discuss whether or not either of those forks make sense. What I found was really interesting is that when people were discussing whether or not those forks make sense, there was 2 different discussions going on. And when you have 2 different discussions going on, it's really hard to get anywhere because you're not having the same conversation. So the one conversation that was going on was, is it a good idea to fork this specific project in this specific way for this specific reason. The second completely different topic that was going on was asking, well, is forking good? Is forking okay? And this is a common, I find, mix-up that people in the free software community often end up in. And what's happening is they're confusing can with should. So I'd like to back up a bit and talk about the can should from a completely different context, not software, not technology at all, but civil rights. So as probably all of you know, in the middle of the 20th century, African Americans in the United States, in the South anyways, really didn't have a lot of rights, to say the least. And segregation was common, where Black people could only use certain bathrooms, they couldn't sit in certain seats on a bus, they couldn't go to the same schools as white people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was institutionalized racism. A huge civil rights movement that erupted in the 50s. And one of the people that a lot of people know is Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her bus seat because she was a Black woman and was living in the South, one of these places where segregation was mandated by law. The white section of the bus was full, and so the bus driver told her to give up her seat, move further to the back of the bus so that white people could sit in the front rows of the Black section of the bus, and she refused. And because of this, she was arrested. And this is often seen as a watershed moment, and they took her to court. Actually, there was one person before her, a 15-year-old girl, also involved in the civil rights movement, Claudette Colvin, in 1955, full 9 months before her, who did the same thing. She sat down in her seat and refused to get up, refused to move to the back of the bus. And so there was this huge civil rights movement that happened, and they were successful, and with a lot of sacrifice and pain, and unfortunately some deaths even. The people of every race, color, and creed now can sit on whatever seat in a bus they want and go to any school they want, and etc. So institutionalized racism is off the legal books. And there's still racism in the US here and there, but it's no longer part of the law. And so this opened up a huge new set of cans for people, especially African Americans. They now could sit in any seat in the bus that they wanted. They now could go to those schools that they weren't allowed to before. They now could go into any restaurant, any bathroom, and drink from any water fountain. This is a whole new set of cans. That's awesome. Now the question is, do we find, Black people in America sitting at the front seat of the bus every single time? Do they insist on sitting in the front of the bus? Well, no, because sometimes it's more convenient to sit in the back because you're, where you get off at that stop, where you're going, it's quicker to get out the back. That's where you're headed anyways. Maybe there's some loud people at the front. Maybe there's something spilled on the seat in the front. You don't want to sit on there. So just because you can doesn't mean you should always, right? You now have the ability to choose where you sit. Just because you can now sit in the front doesn't mean you're always going to. And if you choose not to, it doesn't mean that you're giving up or disrespecting, the rights that you now have and that people fought hard to win for you. And this is between can and should. Everyone should be able to or can sit anywhere they want in the bus. Doesn't matter what color your skin is or what religion you are or anything. But that's a different question that when you're actually in the bus that day, am I going to sit in the front? That's a different question. Can and should. There's also a really interesting group of people called the Doukhobors in Western Canada. They were in Russia. They were Christians, and at the end of the 19th century, they immigrated almost completely en masse, a huge exodus to Western Canada. And you can still see actually some of their old buildings. They came to Canada and just basically started living. Yeah, it wasn't like an official immigration. There was tens of thousands of them that came, and they would build shacks in the middle of places, and they would start working for the farmers and whatnot in the area. They were apparently hardworking people, really good, but they were trying to escape religious persecution. And when they came, they found that they had the ability to protest. which they didn't have, of course, in Russia, or at the time the USSR. Oh no, it was still Russia at the time. This is pre-USSR. Although by the time that the instance I'm thinking of happened, it now was USSR, but they immigrated when it was still pre-USSR. And so they had these rights to be able to protest. And, you know, they had kind of moved in, and the government, they didn't have quite clear rights to all the land that they were living on. And so the Canadian government kind of stepped in and said, no, this isn't right, we have to sort this out. And so the Doukhobors were like, great, we can protest this, which is great, you can. Yes, Canada is a free country in that respect. But it was kind of funny because they got known in some parts for really taking this can and using it all the time and in the most extreme manner possible. So they were known for instance, holding nude protests where everyone in the protest would show up in the street naked and march through the street and go, well, this is our right, we're protesting, hello freedom. That's awesome because, yeah, in one sense they could. And it wasn't all of them that did this. It was a more radical fringe group within the Doukhobor community. But they got known outside of the Doukhobor community for being these people who just like loved protesting and really did it like radically. So again, they could now, and maybe they did it not only too often, but in like more extreme ways than necessary. So again, the can and the should are two different questions. Can they protest? Yes. Should they protest? I think that they probably had something to protest. Should they protest naked? Well, it doesn't bother me, but it wouldn't have bothered me then. But if I was living at the time, this is again mid-20th century when this happened, but maybe not the best approach, right? So maybe they're making the wrong decision on should, even if they're making the right decision on can. So where does this come to free software? I've been talking about rights, and that seems like fully, you know, way removed from technology, except free software is about rights. It's about the rights of users. It's about the rights of people who create, make, distribute, change, and use software or technology in general. And a lot of people, they didn't know, they'd never experienced the can of being able to take software, legally redistribute it, legally make changes to it, or even be able to make changes at all, then distribute those changes, use it however, wherever they wanted without asking permission. I mean, it was just all these cans, right? The 4 freedoms of free software. So suddenly there was, yes, this whole new set of cans, absolutely fantastic and amazing. The question is, how are we using it as the, you know, so the should question. Should we be using these freedoms all the time? So one of these freedoms, one of these cans is forking. Nobody says we absolutely must have to 100% of the time work with an upstream project. In fact, there are times when forking is probably the best answer available to us. But I think that kind of like the naked marching Doukhobors, in free software, we often tend to default to because we can, therefore we will, without stopping for a moment and thinking, but should we? Do we always have to sit at the front of the bus? Is that always the best seat for us on this trip? Do we always have to fork when the smallest thing happens, or when we, yes, couldn't be bothered often, it seems, to actually look at what the options are before us? And it seems that we, you know, as a community, we often don't do that. And as soon as someone says, hey, well, should we be forking this? Does this make sense? Then the canners come out and the people go, oh, well, you can, it's a freedom. Of course you can, you should be, yeah, and no one's arguing that. Everyone thinks that it's great that we can do this, that forking and the other freedoms that derive from those 4 basic freedoms of free software are fantastic, are absolutely wonderful. But where and when do we use those cans, those rights that we have? And I'd love to see the free software community be a little more self-aware and have discussions with a bit more weight attached to them when it comes to, you know, we may fork this, right? I said I wouldn't get into it, but I will just in this one case. In the case of Compiz, I think they probably could have become the new upstream instead of a fork. Now, that also implies that the upstream would be able to accommodate this, right? And so this is the other side of that right and of the can. We go, well, people can fork it, so screw it. I'm not going to accommodate people. If you don't like it, fork it. And because we see, I don't personally, but I think as a community, we see forking as just something you do, you can do, why not go ahead. Speaking of Git, by the way, I kind of blame GitHub for this, fork my code. Yeah, wrong use of terms. It's almost like the people behind GitHub don't understand free software sometimes. But in the sense of preventing forks, if we go, well, forking is not always the best option, then we need to start thinking about how can we prevent forks. And as if you run an upstream project, you might need to think about being more accommodating. And this may come in the form of when you're like, I'm not really working on it anymore. Here, I'm going to allow somebody, pardon me, make it easier for someone, or make it easy for someone to step up and take over. So a fork isn't necessary. Or you can say, I'm going to design the project in such a way that people can make the changes that they probably want without having to force it into the core of the system, without threatening the stability of the system and the maintainability of it. So, there's various approaches to that, modularity and whatnot. So there's a lot to think about when we stop going, well, yeah, we can fork, and therefore forking is great. I think this would be really good because we waste an insane amount of energy on forks in free software. Some forks are great. Some forks are absolutely the right thing to do. I think in the last 10 years, probably 9 out of 10 forks, and I'm probably being conservative, that I have seen have done very little in the end in terms of providing value, and especially compared to the confusion and splitting of efforts that results. Again, people go, well, you split efforts, what's the problem? Lots of experiments can happen. And that just flies in the face of the reality of how much effort it takes to develop a piece of software to the point where it's stable, reliable, well-maintained, etc. And also making sure that there's not a lot of user confusion out there, like, well, there's 10 different forks of this program, of this software, what one do I use? And so, yeah, I think we need to re-examine the rights we now have, and it's understandable why we enthusiastically engage with them, just like the Duke boards did, and go, yay, we can fork, let's fork. But I think we now need to mature to the point we start asking, should we? And in which circumstances should we? And in which circumstances should we not? Personally, I'd love to see LibreOffice and OpenOffice not be two separate projects. They're not the only ones. There's a lot of them out there that I wish were not separate projects and not forks of each other. And it's possible. LXQt had a release today, and that was not a recombining of forks, but projects that were unforking even though they never forked. They came together, they merged. GCC has been forked in the past, and they came back together. The distant past, if you're wondering when that happened, it's probably before your time. But yes, it is possible, it happens. And so, yeah, it'd be really, really cool, I think, if the free software world became more strategic in its thinking, a little more conscious of cost versus benefit, and started asking should. Because thanks to the hard work of people such as the Free Software Foundation and tens of thousands of developers around the world over the last 30 years, we can. And no one questions that. So now we need to ask ourselves should. Okay, so there's my 15-minute or so rant on can versus should in free software. I hope that brings some thoughts to people's minds on these topics. We're actually closing in on 40 minutes, and there's actually no questions in the IRC channel right now, which is fine. Evidently I wasn't controversial enough, or I was not unclear enough. Hopefully it's not that the topics were not interesting enough. So I will see all of you 2 weeks from now. I'm going to have a guest on, someone that probably many of you know. He's going to be joining me to co-host, and he's a funny guy who knows a fair amount about the free and open source software world. So really looking forward to that. I'll announce who it is next week. So look forward to that, and we'll be covering the topics of the Rust programming language, as well as Linux in the enterprise. So those will be the two topics then. Feel free to drop questions either in my email box, on my G+ feed, on YouTube, etc. for that episode. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks. And for tonight, cheers. May the source be with you.